I'm Teisha Bader. Thank you for joining me. U.S. Senator Joe Lieberman passed away in March of this year, leaving behind a legacy of fairness, public service, of being a bridge builder and a mensch. Senator Lieberman was known for working across party lines to help shape impactful legislation during his 24 years in the U.S. Senate and garnering the highest respect from his colleagues on both sides of the aisle. He was also a man of faith, the first publicly observant Jew to reach the highest level of American politics, the first Jewish candidate to be nominated for the office of Vice President of the United States. He was the Democratic nominee for the vice presidential position in the 2000 presidential election. And Senator Lieberman was also a staunch supporter of the State of Israel. Well, in his final book, he writes about how faith, he says, can overcome political divisions. The book is called Faith's Answers to America's Political Crisis: How Religion Can Help Us Out of the Mess We're In. It was released on October the 1st of this year, and Senator Lieberman's son Matthew joins us now to talk about his father's final work and his thoughts and vision for the future of American democracy. Matthew, thank you so much for being here.
It's good to be here with you, Teisha. Thank you for having me.
Of course, and first and foremost, our deepest condolences over the loss of your father. He was truly somebody who was such an inspiration to us, particular in the Jewish world. The impact that he had was enormous.
I appreciate it. It's obviously we feel it as well, and people come up to us all the time and share how really, they've experienced a great loss also, and that's comforting, even as it reminds us of how sad we are every time we hear something like that. But he was a remarkable person, and this book is a final piece of his legacy that he left to us all.
So how long was he working on the book for? I know it was just published earlier this month. Just give us a sense of how long he was working on it and what sort of was the impetus to begin.
Yeah, I want to say it was in the works in one way or another for around a year and a half. He was very diligent, very organized. I don't know how many books he ended up writing in his life. It's something like 10 or 11, I think. And this is for a busy guy, so he was doing it in his extra time. I will say, and I say this as, at least for people who share a mindset that I have, this is a positive. It is a short book. For whatever reason, I find the short books are my favorite books, probably because I get through them more easily. But around a year and a half from idea to proposal to writing it to editing it and all of that. And really, just he saw how dysfunctional and how nasty our politics had become. It wasn't getting any better. And the idea, I think, just bloomed as something that's almost self-evident, that this country, 90% of us believe in a higher power, 80% of us subscribe to one of the three Abrahamic faiths. Principles like the Golden Rule, do unto others, or the Jewish iteration of that, don't do to someone else what would be sort of hateful if it were done to you. These principles are essential to our lives as individuals, yet for some reason people were tossing them aside when it came to politics. And I think he was noticing that for all of us and kind of trying to shake us awake with this book.
So was he sort of saying that, getting back to what you just said, if most people in this country believe in God or in a higher power, can that be a uniting force to either be respectful of other people because we have this one major thing in common, or at least sort of serve as a guide of how we approach each other politically and otherwise?
All of the above. And what he's pointing to is how in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, principles such as the importance of compromise, bipartisanship, or sort of coming to the ability to come to difficult agreements, civility, courage, the willingness to lead even when it's not the popular or obvious thing to do. They are all enshrined in our faith traditions, both in the stories that our religions tell us, whether it's in Tanakh or, for Christianity, the New Testament or the Quran or the Hindu writings. They're enshrined in principles there. They're enshrined in stories that our scriptures relate, giving us examples of how, for us as Jews, how people like Abraham and, Moshe, and, Yoshua, everyone, all just over and over and over again, ways that people acted, not just as individuals, but as leaders, courage to lead, and what characterized their leadership, and civility, and all of these things. And I think what he saw was that religion had come to be used, oftentimes to the contrary, as like a bludgeon, that people feel inspired by their religion to hate other people instead of feeling inspired by the religion to work with other people for the sake of all of us. And he was, again, I think, just trying to open our eyes. It's all right there. You just have to sort of refocus a little bit.
So how did he see that happening in practice? Yeah. That use of this common thing that we all, or that most of the country, you're saying 90% believe in a higher power. We practice in different ways, obviously, different religions, different approaches. How does one put that idea into practice?
Yeah, so it's a challenge, and to use a religious metaphor from Christianity, you might say it's something of a Hail Mary. To accomplish that now, let me give you an example of how difficult it is. I'm doing a few interviews to help promote the book, Word of the Book, which, by the way, this is what it looks like. And one of the first ones I did was with a conservative, I'd say openly MAGA radio and podcast host. And I made some of these points about the importance of working across the aisle and finding compromise, and how even, our texts are filled with examples of whether it's Jacob and Esau, whether it's Hillel and Shammai, whatever, that people sort of our tradition tells us to get over your difference and form consensus and move forward. And the host said, "Well, I sure agree with you, Matthew, but how are you going to do that when the Democrats, ba-dum, 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 ba-dum?" And then he just started hammering at the Democrats. Like, well, you're proof. I didn't say it, but he was proving the challenge, because people are so entrenched in kind of very kind of unitary, goggled way of looking at the world. And it's as simple as a change of perspective. But part of the problem is, whether it's newspapers, whether it's social media, whether it's the cable news TV, everything we see is trying to stir us up. I mean, the entire media they're all tumblers, and they make more money the more they stir us up. And so there are a lot of forces working on us to keep us apart. And again, I think it takes an act of courage and leadership to be able to step back from that. But people respect it. I was watching, I think it was after a town hall that Kamala Harris did with CNN perhaps last week. And then they were talking in Pennsylvania, they were talking to some undecided voters afterwards. And they all agreed that, they didn't want her to attack Trump. They knew Trump was attacking her. They didn't like that either. Voters always tell you they don't want that. The problem is that a lot of voters respond to it nonetheless. So, and this is a time for leaders, and it is, let me, cite, for example, Nachshon, who we're taught had to walk in into the Red Sea, up to his nostrils, so that it would part. Um, and anyone could have done that. Point being, it took courage, but it wasn't hard to put one step in front of the other and do it. He did it. And that's what we have to do in terms of how we're consuming this information, our ability to keep things in perspective, and our ability just to remember who we are. We're children of God. The people we're angry at are also children of God. We're all made, B'Tselem Elohim, in God's image, and we're all of infinite value. And we need to, at least somewhat more than we currently are, start interacting with each other with that in mind.
And your father really, that's really what most people, I think, remember him for and respect him so much for. And it had to have been very difficult, but somehow he navigated that path of walking sort of in both circles, Democrats, Republicans. He was able to do so. It seems he had this incredible character that, and like you said, it was a choice. I'm sure it was a conscious choice of, this is how I am going to be a politician. This is how I'm going to use my years of service. I'm going to try and build bridges, but I'm sure it was very difficult and very tricky many times for him. Did he ever talk about that?
He almost didn't entertain the alternative for these reasons, because one, and this is both in praise of him and also to say that maybe he had it a little easier than most of us would. I mean, I believe he was one of those people that was a little bit extra innately just a good person. And I think his inclination was towards that in the first place. Then you layer on top of it everything he learned through Judaism that reinforces that, from his family that reinforces that. And then you layer on top of that just sort of a political perspective that from the very beginning was about working with other people, that was the bottom line, working with other people who you're going to disagree with to get something done for the people you're there to serve. Yeah. It's as simple as that, just as simple as that. And so I think what's so interesting about him is, as good a person as he was, he was tough, he was stubborn, and he really did embody this idea of you can disagree without being disagreeable. It was one of the kind of shocks to the system, I think, for us in the family, was in probably the last 10 years of his career, and even after he retired, the left in American politics really took on a hatred for him. Really, like at a gut level, they hated him about 2 or 3 things he did in his career, which otherwise he was a pretty progressive Democrat. But they hated him, and it was just wild for us to see these people who obviously didn't know him have that strong and negative emotion about really around the sweetest guy there could be, and who didn't reciprocate it either. He just kind of just went by him. I think it was probably hard for him to deal with that to some extent, but for the most part, he knew he had programmed himself. He was going forward the way that he felt it needed to be done. And again, I will say, I think because how he was wired, it was easier for him than it would be for a lot of us. It was easier for him to sort of not pick up the words of hatred, the words that stir people to anger. But it's something any of us can do. It's not like it's an Albert Einstein sort of accomplishment. It's a profoundly human choice, and we're all given choice. And he made it as an example under very difficult situations in a nasty business. He conducted himself in a certain way. We all can. I think the message of his life is we all can. And in the book, he's telling us also look at our traditions, example after example, in the same vein.
And I do want to talk a bit about his staunch support of the state of Israel throughout his career and throughout his life. I'm sure that got him into challenging situations then. I can only imagine if he was still in the Senate now, especially since October the 7th, what we have seen happen just in this country, around the world, the surge of anti-Semitism. And of course, this was last October. Did he talk at all about what was going on as far as how we all sort of feel like the world turned upside down after that
Yeah.
day?
Yeah, well, yeah, we did. Every Jewish family, we all did, and he did, and we had this unbelievable experience in 2000, as you mentioned at the outset. Of he was on a national ticket with Al Gore. He was all over the country, in places where there probably hadn't been more than a handful of Jews in some time, and you know there was nothing, no threats, no anti-Semitism. Quite the contrary. He'd be greeted on along lines where he'd be shaking hands in, rural America with, God bless you, God bless you. People really connected with him. That's what he felt through his whole career, that his religion was a basis for connection between him and other people of faith. So it wasn't there back then. Obviously, this is something that's been kind of percolating for a number of years, and it was distressing to him. Was surprising to him. He is by nature an optimist. He was by nature an extremely constructive person. So I think he wanted to stay positive and wanted to believe that we would get to this would pass. But he was also a realist and saw what was happening and spoke out strongly when the occasion called for it. And I know if he were still alive, that he would continue doing that. It was at the very core of his being, was to stand strong with Israel. And we were honored, although it wasn't without controversy, but we were honored when Prime Minister Netanyahu wanted to come speak at the memorial service in Washington for my dad. And again, a difficult time, and God knows, not only is opinion split about Netanyahu worldwide, it's split about him amongst Jews and Israelis. But the two of them knew each other for decades and stood shoulder to shoulder many times, many difficult times. And again, any difficult time on an issue like that for him, because he knew so deeply in his core that it was the right thing to do, it didn't feel difficult to him.
I want to go back to Al Gore speaking at your father's funeral. I know that many people spoke. Many people, as you said, the prime minister wanted to be there. And Al Gore was talking about the word mensch, which I used at the beginning of the introduction to describe your father. And he said there really isn't an English equivalent for the word mensch, which is a Yiddish term. But he said those who seek its definition will not find it in dictionaries so much as they find it in the way Joe Lieberman lived his life. Friendship over anger, reconciliation as a form of grace. We can learn from Joe Lieberman's life some critical lessons about how we might heal the rancor in our nation today.
He was great. He was great. And, anytime Al Gore came up in conversation, whether it was publicly, whether it was just with us around the table, and we love the Gores. We love that experience. Obviously, they didn't agree on every political issue through the decades, but my dad was filled with such gratitude. Gore gave him, to use the jargon of today, Gore platformed him. He platformed my dad and gave him that platform, and that was an amazing, it was an act of courage by Gore to select a Jew for the first and still only time to a political position of that high visibility and potentially that importance. So those are beautiful words. He wasn't. We knew we were going to have an event in D.C. later, and our thought was that we would ask him to speak there. We did end up speaking at the one in D.C. We didn't know or expect that he'd necessarily come up to Connecticut. And we got word that he was coming up, and I emailed him. I had his email. I emailed him that night and said, "I hear you're coming. You know, we were going to ask you to speak in D.C., but if you're coming, we're blown away. We'd love for you to talk if you would." And he said, "Sure, I'd love to," and he did, and he was great, and made us feel great.
I'm sure. And before I let you go, I also do want to mention that your father was on JBS about 5 years ago. Our late founder and president, Rabbi Mark S. Golub, a proud Connecticut resident himself, hosted your dad and called him one of his political heroes. And I know he did not throw that term around lightly. He was so deeply honored to speak to your father and just share with him his stature as a national statesman and his profound impact on the Jewish world.
I know it. My dad enjoyed coming on JBS and talking. And just, I should read that passage that you read just now from Gore's eulogy because it says it all so well. And the way I would just say to the people who are listening to this as we head into an extremely fractious presidential election just in a week. And I have a newsletter on Substack called the Lieberman Files where I've been writing about this also. But we've got to prepare ourselves for either result and go forward in the best, most constructive manner as Americans and as Jews. That it's in our DNA as well. And those words that you read that Al Gore spoke at my dad's funeral should be a charge to all of us. And again, a reminder that that's how my dad did it. And we should all aspire to the same.
Thank you, Matthew. And thank you for mentioning that. Yes, we are taping this on October the 29th, just a week ahead of the presidential elections. Not an easy time, but truly an inspirational read. The late Senator Joe Lieberman's Faith's Answers to America's Political Crisis, How Religion Can Help Us Out of the Mess We're In. And Matthew, thank you so much for coming on and speaking about it and just sharing thoughts about your father, who, again, meant so much to all of us. And as you said, his legacy can perhaps continue to serve us in the most positive way. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Good to be here.